and then who is here. And I guess I just name everybody in the room, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And Mrs. Wachs, what's your first name?
Dorothy.
Dorothy. Okay. And then they give us some questions, but you can talk about whatever you want. But we'll go through some of the questions they have, and if there's anything else, in addition to those questions, you can feel free to talk about whatever you want to talk about. Okay. So I guess we're ready to start.
Mm-hmm.
Are you recording now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. We are here in Lexington, Kentucky, the Central Library. We're interviewing Fred Wachs, who was born on May 28, 1923. And I'm the interviewer, Doug Tattersall, and we're here with Ty Emmerich, Dorothy Wachs, and Kathy Reynolds. And we're with the Lexington Public Library. Okay. And where do we start, Ty? We skip
other set of questions.
this set?
Separated for you.
This
Yeah.
set, okay. Okay. Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted
Okay. And where were you living at the time?
on the old Richmond Road here in Lexington.
Okay. Why did you join?
Well, I knew I was going to, if I didn't enlist, I was going to be eventually taken in anyway. And I'd taken some ROTC at the University of Kentucky. I did try to enlist, and they formed a platoon of Marines right after Pearl Harbor, and I did go down with two other fellows to enlist into that, but they wouldn't take me because I wore glasses. But that was in the early part of '42. So I went in about almost a year later, and I'd had 3 semesters of infantry ROTC, and I thought I was ready to go.
Okay. And why did you pick the service branch that you joined?
Well, didn't have a choice. They didn't give you a choice. They just put you where they wanted you.
Okay.
And I ended up with a mule pack outfit to start with. That was in basic training, but we never finished that.
Okay. Do you recall your first days in the service?
Oh yeah.
Can you tell me about those?
Well, you mean at the induction center?
Right. Yeah. Right when you started.
Well, that was just where you were being interviewed and filling out forms and taking a lot of physicals and all type of examinations, and they were trying to, I guess, determine where to send you because we didn't have any choice. I think we did. They did. I think they did ask us, and of course, having all the infantry OTC, I just asked for infantry, but I ended up in this mule outfit. But that was only for a short period because we were shipped out early before we ever finished our basic.
Can you tell me about your training experience? What was that like?
Well, the most intensive training I had was when we got to the Hawaiian Islands and joined this 40th Division. The 25th Division were the division that was stationed on the Hawaiian Islands at the time of Pearl Harbor. And they had pulled them out, and they had been sent to Guadalcanal. So our division took over the defense of the Hawaiian Islands. I mean, we strung barbed wire and all over different places and built concrete pillboxes, which are still there. We saw some a few years ago. And then we got in just intensive training, amphibious training, and we went to Ranger School, and just it was very intensive training. And then they shipped us out to Guadalcanal. And there, the main battle, as I say, was over. And we were there ready to join forces with the 1st Marine Division. They had pulled out of there and were sent back to, I think they went back to Australia to recover from they were full of malaria. And anybody who'd been on Guadalcanal very long had malaria, including me. But I think the operation we were to have with them, MacArthur called off because I think he thought it was a hopeless thing. And they went to Cape Gloucester, and then we relieved them there. And well, it just went on from there. To we went to Oraibi, New Britain was halfway up the coast, and we just kept constant patrols out. And the Japanese did the same. They were being sure we weren't coming up on them, and we wanted to be sure they weren't coming down on us. And that lasted till, we were there till, I'm trying to think when it was, about December of 44, I guess it was. Then we loaded on ships, and they formed a huge convoy up around the Admiralty Islands. We were there. I was on that. It was on LST for 37 days, I believe it was. And then this whole convoy took off for the Philippines. We came into the Philippines right after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and the minute we got within sight of the Philippines, we came under constant air attack, which was terribly exciting, really. I mean, battle on the ground is not very exciting. It's just scary. But you see so much, when you're on a ship and these airplanes are attacked and all this flake going in there and everything. It was really exciting thing to see. But anyway, we went on we went through Mindanao and Leyte and on around past the island of Negros and up the west coast of the Philippines and came into Lingayen Gulf real early one night. And it was the biggest, I guess it was the biggest landing in the Pacific War up to that time, because there were it was the entire 6th Army. And we lined up on wooden rows at night there, and it was all blacked out. And we hadn't been there a few hours, and all of a sudden we are hearing these explosions. And finally realized what happened. These Japanese were coming out in small boats, and these soldiers got out in the water with magnetic mines, and they came up and were to attach these mines, swam up to these boats, and attach these mines on the boats, and when they blow off, one hit our ship, killed 14 men. They're not in my outfit, they were in engineers. And of course they had to seal that compartment off. But it was going on all over the bay there. And so then they turned on searchlights, and they had all of us with rifles laying, looking in the water. They said, shoot at anything you see in the water, boxes, anything, because they put them over their head, And that was kind of scary. In fact, we killed one Jap, climbed up our anchor chain, and a sailor shot him. He was real excited. But that went on the whole night, that night, till it got daylight. And then we went in. We were supposed to land, I think, around 8 or 9 o'clock the next morning, when all the Navy went up and down the beach with all these battleships shooting, and we were strafing the beach. It was quite a sight. It was the most exciting thing I've ever seen. And then the Japanese came in, one drone right after the other with these. First time we'd seen kamikaze planes come in and dive on these ships. They injured, they badly damaged, I think it was 26 ships. I don't remember seeing any of them sink, but they caught on fire. And but that sight was I guess the most exciting thing I ever saw. Till we finally went into land, then we couldn't land because our ship LST was listing, and we hit the ground before we could get to the beach. So these engineers, what was left of them, had to take these metal things off the side of the ship, and they'd make a ramp, and finally we could get their vehicles and things off. But the Japanese fortunately, I guess, for us or them both, I don't know, they pulled back from the beach. And so we didn't have much contact, you know, right on in the landing. It wasn't until we went inland that we began to, at every crossroad they'd have pillboxes where they would stop us for a while. But MacArthur came in and he told our general, he said, get to Manila. He said, go through them, go around them, whatever, but get to Manila. So we were in the 14th Corps, and the 14th Corps was made up of our 40th Infantry Division and the 37th Division, and then the 11th Airborne eventually was in our Corps. And they came in from the south. They came in, it was around in the island of I forgot where they landed, but it was in the south part of Luzon, and we kind of converged. They came in from Manila on the south, and we came in from the north. But our first goal was to take Clark Air Base, and that's where we really hit it hard. I mean, it was surrounded by hills. They weren't mountains, but they were just pretty good-sized hills. And the Japanese had had 3 years to dig those hills full of caves, and they were mutually protected. I mean, if you attacked at one, you were come under fire from the ones on either side. So it was the toughest fighting we got into. We lost most men we lost were pretty much there. Mm-hmm. We found out the caves, the opening faced us, and we'd shoot a 105 right in the opening, but it didn't face them because it had lateral tunnels, and then went, you know, this way, then that way. And so finally we decided the only way you could get them out of there was to shoot flamethrowers in it. And so we had these 115th engineers come up with flamethrowers, and we did our best to protect them. We, you know, try to spot any. We were looking hard for any snipers to pick up. You know, they come out of holes in the ground, because and sure enough, they'd shoot those guys with a flamethrower, and my God, they'd bring an oven up, and he would finally get where they shoot flames in the opening, and then they brought a bulldozer up, and the guy on the bulldozer, he was a brave man too, because they'd shoot him right off that bulldozer. But they'd bring an oven, he'd get on that bulldozer and push dirt up to the opening. And that fire burned in there, particularly when they had napalm, it would suck all the oxygen out of the cave, and those men in there suffocated. That's the only way to get them. You couldn't get them out. Now, sometimes at night they would attack from there. And in fact, they did practically every night. They'd attack some area along our line. But we sealed up 600 caves. And I didn't realize that, but I got a book after the war, and it said our division sealed 600. I guess I was probably in on maybe 40 or 50 of them, but I didn't realize it was that many. But those hills went all the way around Clark Field and into Baton, and that's where we followed. We just had to go from one hill to the next. We went through, took Clark Field along with the 37th Division, and then they pulled them out and hit them straight for Manila. But we had to stay there and clean out these hills that were all around Clark Air Base and going back into Baton. And I know that each hill we were on, we didn't have to dig in because the holes we used on the top of these hills, they were dug by the Japanese 3 years earlier when they attacked our forces when they came into Luzon, you know. Mm-hmm. And it was odd. And then the Japanese were using our holes that they dug 3 years earlier. But it was probably the toughest fighting that we had. Mm-hmm. Later on, we were pulled back. The 38th Division landed at Subic Bay, which is on the west coast of Luzon, and they came up, and we finally emerged. Came together, and they finished the job there, and they pulled us out We went back to Lingayen Gulf for a rest camp, they said, but we were only there about 4 or 5 days, and we were bombed every day. There was an airstrip there, and they bombed it every night, so we didn't get much rest.
Not much of a rest, huh?
No, our tents were shattered with shrapnel falling on. But then they sent, I see my regiment that we were with was held in reserve, and the other regiments landed on the island of Negros. And we sat offshore waiting if we were needed, but they didn't need us, so they sent us MacArthur, or Eichelberger, General Eichelberger. He was in charge of the 8th Army in the southern Philippines, and he wanted us down there because the Japanese on Leyte were coming across the mountains, retreating, and then they were going over to the island of Cebu, and that island hadn't been landed on, and they were reinforcing that island. So they sent us to the northwestern part of Leyte to cut off the Japanese retreat, which we did, and it wasn't quite as bad as what we'd been through on Luzon, because these Japanese didn't know we were there, and most of our slaughter we had there was ambush slaughter. I mean, they came out and we just took them, you know, and we cut off their retreat, and then they pulled us back to Ormoc, which is also in the western part of it was a PT boat base. When we got back there, we had a little rest there. Then they loaded us on ships again. We didn't know where we were going, but we went down and landed at Mackinac Bay, which is on the northern part of the island of Mindanao. That's one of the biggest islands, and it's the roughest country I ever saw in my life. The jungle, and they said, well, we're going down to Sarah Highway. Well, I thought that'd be nice. That was just a path through the jungle. We went about 10 miles, and there was an airstrip there, and we had to take that airstrip. And that was the airstrip MacArthur escaped from the Philippines. When they pulled him out, they took him down there in a PT boat from Corregidor, and he flew out of there when he left the Philippines. But anyway, the Japanese had taken it over, and they didn't have too much force there. We were able to take that airstrip pretty quick. I know that, but there'd been a lot of them killed when we'd bombed earlier, and they had a whole row of graves there. And when they make a grave, they put a little thing of rice and a little bottle of sake there with the grave. And I know our men, boy, they went down there and took all that sake. And they said, oh, you better not drink that, it'll be poisonous. We all drank it anyway, because we figured they wouldn't poison their dead men. So, then we went on down. As I say, it was terribly rough country, but we had we call them Moro Scouts. They were the people that lived on the island of Mindanao, which were all Muslims, and of course, they're the ones we fought during the Spanish-American War, I guess. And I guess they hated us, but they hated the Japanese worse because they'd been treated so bad. So they joined forces with us, and they were good. They were vicious fighters. And they knew all the trails, and they knew their way around in the jungles. And the only trouble with them, they'd kill the Japanese and take their uniforms, and we'd just run into them. We shot several of them, thought they were Japanese. But also another fun thing they did, they told them they'd pay them so much per head, killing the Japanese. And the first time they came in, they brought a pole, and I guess it had 20 Japanese heads. They were hanging by their ears. They cut their heads.
Oh, my goodness.
And they said, well, now that's not what we meant. And so then they bring their ears in to get paid for them. But the central part of Mindanao was these huge gorges, and our engineers, I think they built 15 bridges so we could get through that area. And we were to meet up with I think it was the 37th Division, they landed on Davao, which is on the southern part of Mindanao. And they were coming north, and then there was another division, the 24th, I believe, was at Zambiango, and they were coming from the west, and we were going to converge. We were coming from the north. And the Japanese 100th Division was right there in the center. So we were converging on them, and the only thing they could do was to split up, because and you know, some of those Japanese survived until 1960 in that jungle. How, I don't know. But we just, you know, tried to wipe them all out if we could. We had several experiences there. I know we pulled into a place north of a town called Malabali, and there was a sign that said U.S. Experiment Station Farm. And I wonder what it's doing down here. But then we drove in, and there was a cornfield there. And boy, we jumped off, ran over there, and sure enough, they had roasting ears on it. And I know later on, after we'd gotten in position, we went up there, five of us, I think, and picked corn. And luckily, I'd bought a pistol from a Marine in Guadalcanal. I had it in a shoulder holster. And the others was put their rifles against a tree, and we started picking corn. And we were going along pretty good, and finally we heard this noise and looked up, and here comes five Japanese, 5 or 6, I never knew for sure. They were picking corn coming the other way. Well, the boy that I was with took off running out, and I saw these Japanese. At first, they dropped to the ground. No, their rifles were over the slower. They tried to unsling their rifles, so I was able to get my pistol out, and I emptied a clip. I don't know whether I hit one or not, but it made them drop to the ground, and so I was able to get out too before they could get their rifles unslung, and then we had a little firefight there for a while, but they found they took off. But we did have some fresh corn. Then I think the closest I had to getting it was a couple of nights later in that same area. We set up a perimeter at night, sort of a half-moon shape, with about 6 positions, 2 machine gun positions, the rest of it was just rifle pits. And there were 3 of us. We'd dig what you call a T-hole. It was shaped like a T, and you know, one sleep this way, another 2 this way. And we weren't expecting any trouble. And I was on a telephone. We had a telephone line strung around the line, and I could speak to the other positions, or I could speak back to the CP. And it started raining, and it was so dark that in the jungle that it was just pitch dark. You can't see anything. And I was on the first guard duty. You're on 2 and off 4. And it was only about 10, 11 o'clock at night. I know we began to hear something. Or one of the other positions said they heard something. So we called in a CP, and the lieutenant there said, he said, some boy shot a Filipino's caribou the other night, walk around. He said, better not shoot. He said, he might shoot a caribou. So we just sat there and listened. But boy, after a little while, I knew that there were more than one. I could hear them different. And sure enough, one of them walked right past me. I couldn't see him, but I could hear him going slow and hear him breathing now almost. But he went a little further, and there we'd cut an opening in the trees. We cut some trees down to give her field of fire for the guns, and I saw his shadow there, and he, I think, realized he wasn't where he was supposed to be, where he wanted to be. And I heard him arm a hand grenade. They'd hang him on their helmet. And I said, I don't know who was coming. I didn't know whether he knew where to throw it. And I heard it hit the ground in front of me. And fortunately, I wasn't even in the hole where I was. It was about as far as me from Dorothy there. I was just sitting on a stump. So I flattened out on the ground, and there was a little thing like that, and I stuck my face down in the dirt, and I didn't have my helmet on, and I could hear that hand grenade fuse burning. And I thought, boy, I'm done for. And there's another guy he'd gotten in a hammock that night, but he heard it too, and he took his knife and slid out the bottom. And if he hadn't done that, he'd been killed. Well, that hand grenade went off and just ripped his hammock shreds. But it didn't hit me, but it deafened me for a while. But anyway, this guy came toward me, and I put him down with a pistol. But the next morning, as it got, we could hear him making some noise. But when it got light the next morning, we kind of kept our heads down. I don't know whether he was still alive or not, but I could see something over there. But anyway, I'd gotten in a hole then, the other two guys, there were three of us there. And all the machine guns, they'd opened up on them, but they wounded one, I think. But I know the one I shot, we got up there the next morning, he was gone. But his rifle and his pack and everything was laying there. And we finally got up a little patrol, and they tracked him down. He was gone too. When they found him in a little tool shed that had on this experiment station for him for two hose and stuff, and he gotten in there. And but after that, we pretty well cleaned him out, and we came on back. Had to make the same trip back that we came down, which took a week to get back, I guess. And the war from then on was pretty much over for us. We went on to the island of Panay, and there was still some fighting there. We drove the Japanese back up into the hills and mountains, and the things they did there, you just couldn't believe. I mean, just savage things. They jerk babies out of women's arms and throw them up in the air and catch them on their bayonets, things like that.
Oh, my goodness.
And when they tortured somebody, and they did a lot of that, if they could capture anybody alive, I couldn't describe it to you. But it made us want to do the job. But when we went back to Panay, I know one day some guy got a radio in and said they dropped an atomic bomb somewhere. We didn't know what that was. But we soon found out, and of course, then the Japanese surrendered. But then we couldn't get the Japanese out of the hills. They didn't believe that the emperor would ever surrender, because they didn't believe in surrender, and that was just unheard of, And we took prisoners, some that they had captured alive, or maybe I'm not sure they were prisoners. But anyway, they could speak Japanese. And they took them up there with loudspeakers and tried to, get them to come in. That told them that the war was over. And I think it took about 2 weeks before they finally did come in. They finally came in, and they caused no trouble. We met them at an area and marched them down into an airstrip. They stacked their rifles, and they had a sort of formal surrender. But that was the end of the war for us. I mean, we went to, we found out then, we didn't know it at the time, but just before that we were going to land on Japan. We were going to be the first division to land. But that didn't last very long. We began to get new equipment and everything for that, but when the atomic bomb was dropped, that was it. We went to Korea. We were the first troops in Korea. So that, I think that about it. Does you have any questions on it?
Yeah. Let me go through some of these questions, because you covered a lot. We'll just go back and fill in some blanks that they have here. Thinking back to boot camp and training, do you remember the instructors? Do you remember anything about your instructors?
Yeah, we had a sergeant named Beasley. It was pretty tough, but that was when I was in the mule outfit,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a tough outfit. Those mules, and I used to fooling with horses, but mules are something else. I mean, these mules were all right out of a remount station, you know, where they picked them up, and we had to break them. And any of us that had been on a farm, boy, that's the job we had, you know, break his mule. And they were smart. A mule was smart, and we'd get them on like they do in a rodeo, and shoot, and have a thing on their back, and get on their back, and they let them out, and they'd buck 2 or 3 times. If they couldn't throw it right away, that was the end of it. They were okay, but it was hard to trust them. They told us, you know, when a mule, you could tell when he was going to kick. I mean, you'd hunch up to kick, and you'd try to back off. They said, no, never back off. He said, go into him, and then he said, he'll knock you down, he'll push you back. But he said, if you back off and you get that blow from him, he's down there to kill you. Mm-hmm. And some boys were hurt bad. Some, they said, never wrap, when you're leading the mule, wrap the shank around your hand. They said, don't ever wrap around, hold it loose. Because if he breaks off and runs, and you get your hand caught, then you get dragged. And I saw several of them do that, and boy, I mean, it skinned them. It was terrible what they did to them. So we were glad to give up the mules. I know part of our battalion there in the basic training eventually ended up in they call it the 98th Field Artillery Battalion. They were sent to New Guinea, and they didn't use them because they got these little Caterpillar tractors you pull guns and equipment things with. So MacArthur, he wanted a Ranger outfit, so he took these men. To be in a mule pack, he had to be over 6'1" or something like that, and they were all pretty good-sized men. And so he retrained them in the Guinea to be the 6th Ranger Battalion, and they were with us. They landed on Luzon. And they were the ones that freed one of the prison camps, Kovanilon, where they had 500 prisoners that were, you know, taken when the Japanese first, you know, right after Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. And those were men had suffered terribly. And they were able to slip up on that camp from, well, they went, I think, 25 miles behind the line, and a little place called Blencarin. And then from there they crawled up on around this camp in the late afternoon and surrounded it. And the only way, the guards on the tires there, why they didn't see them, I don't know, but they got them to fly some airplanes over, and they were looking at these airplanes while these guys crawled up. And at a certain time, they opened fire on these guards, and they killed all the Japanese guards in that camp and got all those prisoners out. It was really a fabulous operation, I thought. At the time that happened, I thought I saw those prisoners because we were at a place called Capus on Luzon. We came through this little town, and these men were standing there beside the road, and we knew immediately that they had been prisoners. They were just terrible looking, skeletons, you know, just didn't have, some of them just on short pants, no shoes. But they had been in a Camp O'Donnell, which is about 6 miles out of this town of Capus. And later on, when I heard about this thing, I thought I'd seen the prisoners this Ranger outfit captured, but they weren't. They were ones out of O'Donnell. I don't know who got them out. But I did see a boy there. It's the only guy I ever recognized in the old time I was in the Army. He was sitting there with these men, and he didn't have his helmet on. And I reckon he was one I took basic training with in the mule pack. And I hollered at him, and he said he's with the 6th Rangers. So I guess they did something about getting his men out too, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. When you first left Hawaii and arrived at Guadalcanal, kind of your first place you were, do you remember what that was like as you arrived?
Well, Guadalcanal, you see, there were no piers there. The ships had an anchor offshore, about 400 yards offshore, and we had to go in small boats. But as we got up there, it's hard to say it was a pretty outfit. It had mountains in the background, but they were coconut groves along the beaches there. And from a distance, it was kind of, looked kind of spooky. But then as you got up close, it looked right pretty, But when you walked ashore, you didn't have to walk 10 feet. You said, well, this is no paradise. I mean, the mosquitoes, the bugs, you just had to get used to them. They just were all over you. And you couldn't be there, I don't think, a month or 2 weeks without getting malaria. And fortunately, they came out with this Adabrin, a little yellow tablet. And I know the word ran around that would make you sterile. Mm-hmm. Well, nobody want to take it, But after he had some malaria, he had some of those chills and fever. I know an officer was down there when they had mess. As you come out of the mess hall, he was standing there with a pill, and he'd open his mouth, and he'd throw it in his mouth, and they'd walk about 10 feet and spit it out, Mm-hmm. But after this, they realized it did hold the malaria back. We did take it, and we took it from there on at the end of the war. But it was a miserable place, as was New Britain. But now the Philippines was different. I mean, of course, we had mosquitoes there, and there was jungle in places, thick jungle, but it wasn't near as bad as Guadalcanal. Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that was the biggest enemy we had there was the island.
How many casualties were there in your unit?
Oh gosh, I really don't know. The men get wounded. If there was a slight wound, they'd go to an aid station, and then they'd come back to the unit. If it was a little more serious, we never saw them again. And
so you never found out whether or not they survived, or
no. Oh, once in a while, there was somebody in the hospital in the White Islands would write a letter that some guy would get, that he was, coming out, mm-hmm. coming out of it. But that's something we didn't want to think about. Mm-hmm. I really don't know how many casualties we had. There was a lot of them. In fact, I've heard, most of the movies taken during the war were taken by the Navy, and they did not like MacArthur. Mm-hmm. So the Philippine battle was MacArthur's, and when you hear them talking about Okinawa, which was a big battle, but it was one army, the Army, the 10th Army, then they had the Marines, and then the Navy, and then right after that, Iwo Jima. But, we lost more men in the Philippines than we lost in Okinawa and Iwo Jima put together, and killed 4 times as many Japanese. But they never mentioned that. You read these things I see on television. Mm-hmm. They don't mention MacArthur's fight. Mm-hmm.
How did you stay in touch with your family?
Well, you write them letters, and the letters I'd get from home usually took about 2 months. And I guess maybe it took that long for them to get mine. I really don't know for sure. But the mail did come back and forth.
What was the food like?
Well, that's another thing. It got to be terrible at some places. I know on the island when we were on New Britain, we were getting Australian rations. This was bully beef, came in a can with this white grease made out of goat grease. We got it. It was hard to put down. Well, but we got to we were on a lagoon at Arari, and there was a jungle river emptied in this lagoon. And we went out there to swim one time, and we saw these fish hitting the water. So a fellow threw a hand grenade out there and stunned these fish. We'd swim out, pick them up. And we finally got so we could almost feed a platoon. And they put us on details doing that. We did that for, I don't know, a week or two. And we'd get a whole bunch of good big fish. And we finally we'd use TNT blocks, electric detonators. We could stand there and set them off when we wanted to. But one day we were doing that, and something went by me, and I thought it looked like a submarine. It was a big shark. And I guess it was a white shark, because they're the biggest, I guess. But he never was aggressive towards us. All he wanted was those fish. And boy, he went around and he picked up every one of them, and drove us off, of course. And so the next day, we waited a couple of days. Then we went back and tried again, and he didn't show up. So we went out, and sure enough, some guy hollered and was watching for him. Said, "Here he comes." It was just like a dinner bell, He homed in on that. And we tried to blow him up with big charges of Japanese mortar shells, and it wouldn't faze him. Just kill more fish. And then the crocodiles began to come up after us. One of the natives warned us one day, hollered at us, he kept going like that. Didn't know what he was saying. And we started backing out of the water. You could walk up to your waist, and there was a drop-off. We'd back up, and we saw something coming through the water. You could see 3 trails, and finally it occurred to us they were crocodile. I just never thought a crocodile come out in salt water like that. But they followed us clear up the beach. So they started shooting at them, and then it ran them off. But that ended our fishing. We didn't fish anymore. But the food, the ration from Australia is just hard to take. But you got to eat something. Otherwise, the C ration, when we were out away from where our kitchen was, we were on either C ration or K rations. The C rations weren't too bad. It had some canned stuff, but you could only carry, a couple of days of it. But the K rations, you could, last a week or so. And they weren't what you call good, but did the job. I mean, it kept you going. It wasn't that Australian bully beef was hard for me to eat. I lost a lot of weight too on that.
Did you have plenty of supplies?
I mean, food supplies?
No, just generally just the supplies you needed in general.
Well, we didn't have any trouble, getting ammunition, and of course your clothes, they kept back in what was the outfit that kept all that stuff? And if we were at any time and spend any time in one spot, they could bring up fresh clothes, and then we could wash our clothes. But sometimes when I eventually became on what they call fire direction, where we went with our infantry regiment, and we were away from any of our camp for a week or two at a time. Your clothes get pretty raunchy because it rained so much. It was either wet or muddy or something. But eventually, you just get something you get used to. Sitting out in the rain at night or sleeping in the rain in a hole. And I can remember looking at a guy in the hole, and his head would be underwater on one side and the mosquitoes would cover his face on the other side.
Did you feel pressure or stress during this time?
Oh, yeah, I guess so. Yeah, fear. You can't avoid death. But that's something you kind of get used to, I guess.
Was there something special you did for good luck?
Some boys did. I mean, carried things, but I never did.
How did you entertain yourself?
Well, if they could get anything to drink, they drank. But no, there wasn't any entertainment. Well, now there was one time, and I didn't get to see that. When relieved the 1st Marine Division at Cape Gloucester. There's a big airstrip there, and then they brought, what was that? That movie star, you know, I just saw later on at the Derby.
With the big mouth.
Huh?
With the big mouth. Joe.
No, she was bent. They took a picture of her, you know, bending over a thing, and
Oh, I forgot.
Carol Annis, wasn't that her name, Carol? She would put a show, but I didn't get to see it because I was on patrol. But some fella took a picture of her. She acting like she was loading this field piece, and it was kind of a revealing picture. And he sold them all over. He must have sold 1,000 of those pictures. I don't know how he got them developed. And I had this picture with me later on after the war, and we were at the Derby, and this girl was there. I still had that picture in my wallet, and I thought, well, I'll just get her signed. I walked up and showed it to her, and she said, "Where in the hell did you get that?" I said, "Don't you remember that?" "Oh, yes," she said, "but I didn't know it looked like that," she said, and she wouldn't give it back. I said, "Listen, do you know he was doing that?" I said, I bet there's 1,000 of those pictures out. But then Joe E. Brown, he did come around. We were on Leyte in a little town called Balaba. And we would come in off patrol, and we saw a bunch of soldiers standing around, and these 2 guys up on a little mound there, and the minute I saw him, I knew who it was. He just put on a little show there talking, and he had this guy play the banjo. And his son had just been killed in New Guinea. But then he went around to all this perimeter. They had machine gun positions, you know, surrounded around that little town. And he went around to each one, sat down with those men, be about 4 men in a hole there, and would sit and talk to them, and we really appreciated that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What did you do when you were on leave?
On leave?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we didn't get any leave that I can remember. There wasn't any place to go.
Yeah.
Let me think. When the war ended, yeah, we did have leave. When the war ended, we were on down at Panay, and we did get leave to go into this little town of Iloilo, and there wasn't much anything to do there hardly. And we heard some awful stories, you know, what happened to them during the occupation. Of course, we had to leave in the Hawaiian Islands, and there were plenty of bars. And then they had a USO, but not many of us went there, I don't think. And of course, in Korea, there just wasn't much there either. I mean, for entertainment. We actually were sent, just a platoon of us were sent to a huge Japanese naval base, and they were very cooperative. We were supposed to disarm them and ship them out, send them home. But we only had 2 6x trucks, so we could only take 2 truckloads a day to go clear down to Busan, and then they put them on ships and send them home. But they were very cooperative. I think it was a Japanese colonel or something. And we just had a second lieutenant, and he would tell this colonel what he wanted done, and they were very cooperative. They stacked all their arms, and of course they were ready. They wanted to go home. And the Korean people hated them, you know. And I know I got an emergency furlough there, and they radioed in to us and said, "Send me in at emergency furlough." And I said, "Tell them I didn't ask for any emergency furlough." So they radioed back and they said, "Send him in." So I got on a truck with all these Jap soldiers and rode in, and the Koreans would throw rocks at them. They just hated them. And we went into Busan, and I found out I did have emergency furlough. My father had a serious operation, and some of his friends got together and tried to get me home to be on the farm there. And so they handed me this paper and said, "You got emergency furlough." And I said, "Well, how do I get home?" Oh, he said, you just take it anywhere. You take it out to the airport. They put you on a plane. They had no plan at all. So the plane came in, and we went up to pilot, and he said, I got Danny Kaye on this plane. He's going to entertain the troops here. And he said, I won't be here for 2 or 5 days. So another sergeant and I had emergency furlough. There was a railroad that went to Seoul, Korea, which is pretty good ways. So we went over there and got on this railroad, and these Koreans were getting on there and just stacking on the roof and everywhere. And we finally got either end of the car, and both of us had a pistol, and we wouldn't let any more on, so we could at least sit down on that. And then we got to Seoul, and spent the night in the hotel. We're trying to locate a plane, and sure enough, there was a Kimpo airport out of there, and we finally were able to get on a mail plane going from there to Tokyo, or not to Tokyo, going to Yokohama, a Sagi airfield. And fortunately, there was the regimental commander of our regiment, colonel, he was on this plane, and he told to us sergeants, he said, now, we're going to land in Sagi. He said, you all going to Tokyo? Well, we were trying to get the Air Transport Command to get the flight home. And he said, if you boys will help me with my bags, he said, I'll get you there. And sure enough, we landed in this airstrip, a Sagi airstrip. And we got off the plane, and he looked around. He saw a Jeep coming across this. He waved this guy down, called him over. He said, boys, put my bags in there. So we did. And this sergeant on the Jeep said, Colonel, he said, I'm supposed to be over this other base. He said, soldier, don't you worry about it. He said, you're going to Tokyo. And we got in, and he said, I'll write you a letter. He said, you won't get in any trouble. And he drove us, it was about 40 miles, I guess, from Tokyo. And then the Air Transport Command building was right across the moat from the Imperial Palace. And then right down the street at a place called the Daiichi Building was MacArthur's headquarters. So we got to watch MacArthur come in every day, all these Japanese crowding around. They were very high on him. And we were there, I think, 4 or 5 days before we could get a plane. But we had a good priorities, and we finally flew from there to Guam and Kwajalein, then to Johnson Island. A little old island, the airstrip went from one end to the other, and there was one tree. We take on gas there, and then this is a little C-47. Then we flew the Hawaiian Islands at Hickam Field, and they put us up, said, we'll get you on a plane when we got one going back. Sure enough, at midnight they woke us up, and they had a B-24 going back. So we got on that B-24, and we came into San Francisco at daybreak, and we got to sit up that nose and flew over San Francisco and landed right outside of there. And there we were able to get some uniform. We didn't have any uniform or anything. We got some uniform, and then we couldn't. The pilots wouldn't put you on a plane there. We had to get on a train finally, and got home.
Do you remember anything that was especially humorous or unusual that happened?
Did I ever tell you all anything in it? I can't think of. Well, I'm sure there was humorous things. We had boys, every minute you go into position, you start digging in case you come under mortar fire or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I know we had a fellow that he didn't like to do that. And we did get mortar fire sometimes, and he would jump in somebody else's hole. They'd grab him, pull him out. We had a lot of fun with that. Oh, yeah, there were funny things that happened. It's hard. I can't think what they all were. I mean.
Mm-hmm. What did you think of your officers and your fellow soldiers?
Well, there was a sure mixed crew. I mean, they were from everywhere. I was very fond of my squad sergeant. He was a staff sergeant, and I guess he's the only one I visited after the war. He lived in Montana. He lived on a ranch in Montana, and we went out there. When was it? About early 90s. I waited too long because he said, "Oh, if you'd come out here sooner," he said, "I'd take you up in the Northwest country." He had pack horses. They hunt fish up there, but he'd gotten too old, and he'd had some strokes. And he's the only one I really ever was able to see after the war.
Do you remember when you first arrived home? You arrived home so that you could be working on the farm, right? Can you remember those first few weeks when you were home, what you did, and what you did from there with your life?
Well, the first night I got home, I met some girl. What was that? It was a Kappa.
At the Kappa House,
Yeah, Buddy Parker
Buddy Parker.
took me over there, and
I knew Buddy. Buddy introduced him.
And that was your first night back.
yeah, the first day I got in early that morning, and then I was still on a furlough, so I couldn't get out of the Army till that furlough. It's the only furlough I ever had. I guess it was a month, wasn't it?
At least.
Yeah, it was in December. Then I went up to Camp Atterbury, Indiana, where I was discharged. It's funny, I looked at the board out there and I saw Colonel Brannon. And I used to date a girl named Betty Brannon. Her father was a major at the university, ROTC. And I said, I wonder if that's him. And I finally went up to the main office there where his office was, and sergeant there said, "What do you want?" And I said, "I want to see Colonel Brannon." He said, "What for?" And I said, "Well, he's my neighbor. I dated his daughter." Oh, he didn't. I don't think he believed me. But he went in. Oh, he came out, and he was real friendly. A lot of fun.
Now, did you go back to school?
Yeah. I had a GI Bill, and let's see, what was I? Junior?
I don't know. He graduated in
Something.
48.
Yeah, I went back till I graduated.
And what did you go on to do? What did you study, and what did you do?
I took agriculture, and of course we lived on the farm, and we raised, of course, had tobacco and cattle, and I had a horse. Right before the war started, some of these horse farms realized they had maybe too many horses. The horse business was going down, and they knew it would during the war. So they gave mares away to 4-H club boys or ag boys, and I got a good brood mare. She was about 18 years old, but she had produced a stakes winner. And so I had her bred before I went in the Army, but then the foal was born after I was in the Army, and I never did see the foal. But when he became a yearling, they put him in the Keeneland's summer sale, but he got colic and they had to put him over the fall sale. But anyway, he brought the top price that day. So my father, they had a picture of him in the paper, so he mailed that to me, and he brought $10,000, which was a lot of money then. And I showed that around my outfit, and they couldn't believe, a horse bring that much money.
Did you join any veterans organizations?
Yeah, finally, my brother and I joined Veterans of Foreign War, which, I don't know, we never did really participate much in it. But I'm still a member.
Did your
Get a
military?
bill. I get a bill from them every now and then.
Did your military experience influence your thinking about war or about the military in general?
Well, I guess it did.
How so?
We have a grandson. He's on his second tour in Iraq right now, and he's in an infantry striker unit. And he thinks they're doing the right thing. He was home on furlough here just recently.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe what we're doing has to be done. It's no fun. I mean, it costs lives, but it could be worse if we have to do it over here, I feel. And that's what the Army's for. And actually, the casualty rate has been so low. I mean, it's 1% of what World War II was.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, one is too many. But I feel it's something that has to be done, or else we're going to have to fight them here.
Yeah.
Our borders are wide open; they can come right in.
How did your service and your experiences in the service affect your life, looking back?
Well, I'm not really. I don't know. I guess I like to shoot a lot. I like to hunt, or did, until I lost my eyesight. And boys I hunted with, and when we shot a lot of sporting clays and things like that, we're veterans.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, I don't know that it affected it much. When I went back to school, I think we just pushed it out of our mind and, went on.
Mm-hmm.
I think more about it now than I ever used to. I mean, hardly a day goes by you don't think about it now. But back after the war, I know it just kind of wiped it out of my mind.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, not that I know of.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing your information. That's really interesting to hear, and I think it's really important that you've shared it with us.
Well, unless somebody that just hadn't been in a war, you think what you're doing is right, even if you have to kill people,
Yeah.
And you do. That's where you're there. Particularly if you're in an infantry division. But we got good friends who were in the Air Force, and they suffered too.
Mm-hmm.
We had one friend who was shot down over Germany, and he spent a couple of years in a prison camp. But boy, he sure got they got a lot of awards after that. I mean, I think he got settlement. I think they made a $25,000 settlement at one time, and just being a prisoner. And in the Pacific War, you couldn't be a prisoner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I know the boys I know that were killed. Some of them parachuted out over Japan. They found them buried with their heads on them, cut their heads off. And anybody surrendered. The Japanese thought it was a coward. I mean, they didn't believe in surrender. And so any of our soldiers at that time that surrendered were tortured to death. Then they cut their heads off. And they tried to do that in some cases where you could hear them. Well, that just made us easier for us to put them down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I saw 5 men that were crew on a B-25 that landed off the Lingayen Gulf Beach while we were landing, and they were captured alive, and I wouldn't want to tell you what it did to them. But everybody saw that, had no problem from there on. And they said no quarter, that was it.
I do appreciate it.